Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to look at the first half of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. I've done two videos on slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and I covered a section of slavery where it talked about the Europeans going to Africa and actually capturing slaves. There were laws against the burning and pillaging and capturing of slaves, and people were charged with it, but there was no repercussions. And I did another video written by an abolitionist named Anthony Benazet, and he talked about and documented the slave trade in Africa, where there were Africans selling Africans, Africans capturing other Africans for Europeans, and also Europeans capturing slaves, and the whole divide and conquer tactic that the Europeans were using against the Africans to procure more slaves. And my last video was an hour long because I wanted to get through all of that so we could get into the narrative of Frederick Douglass. And we're going to spend some time with Frederick Douglass because he was a very prolific writer. He was involved in many things in his life. He's not just his narrative, not just his escape, but we're going to start with that. Now, it's very important to read this narrative, and you should read it with the notes, anecdotes, and everything, because he was not only a great writer, he was a what they call a philologist or philologian, a person who studies literature. And throughout this narrative, this version that I have, which is Barnes & Noble's classic with the introduction and notes by Robert O'Mealy, when he quotes different types of literature and Bible passages, it points it out. And he does it on many occasions in his description of slavery. Even his name, Douglass, he got that from a poem, Lady of the Lake. And we're going to read that. And throughout this coverage of Frederick Douglass, I'm going to actually read different passages from the book, because he does have a lot of prose narrative in this book, which is very nice to read out loud. But the importance of this narrative today is that it answers a lot of questions that people argue about. And if you read this narrative along with other narratives, you see that people today don't read and they don't know that much about slavery. Now, the book starts out, he talks about where he's from. He doesn't know how old he is, and he explains that most slaves on the plantation where he was born and throughout the South, and where, well, not just throughout the South, but during this period there was slavery in the North and the South, but they don't know how old they are. And he talks about how this affects him, because he said that the white kids used to know their age, and he wanted to know his age. He didn't know who his father was, but he's pretty sure that his father was his first slave master. Now, this was a very interesting part of the narrative, because he talked about himself having possibly a white father, and he's pretty sure, because there's no rumors about him having any black fathers, but there's all kind of rumors, and he's pretty sure that his father was the slave master, a white slave master. But the reason why this is important is because we have some illusion today that the mulatto slaves or the light-skinned slaves or the slave master's children were treated better than the rest of the slaves, or that they were put into the house and made into house slaves. And Frederick Douglass refutes that, and not in an arguing form, but he just talks about his life and what he observes and what's going on the plantation. And he said that the sons and daughters of the slave masters were treated worse than all the rest of the slaves, and for many reasons. And one of the main reasons is that the sons and daughters of slaves were constant reminders to the mistress and brothers and sisters that the slave master has these children with slaves. And most of the time, they were sold off the plantation immediately, ripped away from their mothers and their relatives and people who they know, because the mistress didn't want the slave master's children of slaves around as a constant reminder of his infidelity. And many times, if they did keep the slaves, the white brothers and sisters of that slave many times were ordered to beat the mixed slaves, because they didn't want any familial bonds between the white kids and the black kids, even though they were brothers and sisters. So he goes into that explanation of how a lot of times the sons and daughters of slave masters were treated worse than regular slaves, because they had this extra attention given to them, and it was negative attention. And then he goes in further to talk about slavery as a whole, and he explains that the slave masters, the children of slave masters, I'm talking about like the white kids, they were all sleeping with these slaves. Large scale. And he said, Frederick Douglass said that he could even see a whole new race, a new breed of people rising up on these plantations, and it wasn't the same as the slaves from Africa, or the Africans coming into being sold into slavery. Now, this was going on wholesale all over the plantations, a new population of people, and it was slave masters mixing with slaves just to get it off. They have many reasons, but another reason is like they were making more slaves. These slaves that had babies, those slaves were sold into slavery. So if your father was the master, you still were a slave. And I go over that, and I talk about the slave papers in one of my other videos of my family, where it was a mulatto slave. And I didn't find out till later, but in the notes I put down that my mother told me that he was believed to have been the slave master's son as well. And they didn't work in the house all the time. They worked out in the fields. And Frederick Douglass also, he had to work out in the fields. Now, another interesting thing about this narrative that Frederick Douglass doesn't really point it out how I'm going to explain it, but he talks about the setup of the plantation. And he talks about the names of the slave masters being like colonel and captain. And he says that he guesses that it's because they, at one time or another, have been on a ship or sailed a ship. But I've come to find out that these plantations were set up like militias. And all of these overseers and slave masters and slave makers, because he talks about slave makers breaking in slaves, they had a militia. So if there was an uprising, or if there was a slave escaping, or any unrest among the slaves, they had a strict system on how to shut it down. And these overseers walked around armed, and he talks about witnessing slaves getting shot, slaves that didn't want to get beat up, try to run and try to hide to keep from getting beaten. They get shot. No white man ever gets charged for killing a slave. They had some laws on the books about killing slaves because slaves were property, but they didn't enforce those rules, and he talks about that. And this narrative is written in a way like Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist, and he doesn't call out any names of any people who helped him along the way. Now, I haven't gotten to the part where he actually runs away, but there are sections that he already mentions of people being nice to him, people who helped him in certain situations, and he says, I don't want to say their names because if I say their names, there may be repercussions for them helping out a slave. But he calls out everyone else. And this is written in an abolitionist form against slavery, because he not only talks about the horrors of slavery on slaves. Now, this book is very, very graphic. I mean, it's very graphic. He talks about women getting strapped up and lashed until the warm blood coming out of their backs. He talks about himself getting lashed and having welts bigger than his thumb and his fingers. He talks about as a child when he was freezing, and he has he has splits and stuff in his feet from freezing, that he could stick his pen in. The pen that he's writing this narrative, he said the scars that he has are so big and bitter that he can stick his pen in. And one of the biggest forms of suffering that he talks about is hunger. Like hunger, if you read this, you'll see that hunger was the worst and where he suffered the most. There's occasions where he would rather face getting beaten or face meanness and cruelness than go hungry. And in many plantations, he said that even slave masters were frowned upon for starving their slaves. Like that was a great offense. And then he talks about the slaves and their relationship between each other and the slave master. He talks about like slaves arguing and fighting with each other from different plantations over who had the better master. And we see this among black people today, where they want to represent their city or represent their state or represent their coast, and they get into arguments and fights and stuff about whose city is better, even though all over the United States, police brutality against black people is running rampant. You can't name a coast. You can't name any large city where where in the past 10 years police brutality hasn't taken place. But you still got people that want to, black people, because this is black literature, black history, who want to represent their city, and they get into arguments, bashes, fights, and everything. And it happens, and these were slaves arguing about who had the better master, the better plantation. And again, like I said, there's some prose in here. There's some prose that I'm going to read on a separate video. I'll just read it, where he talks about his grandmother growing up, raising slave children, raising white children, being of service, and then she got old and crippled, and instead of taking it easy, the slave master put her out in solitude, and she withered away, starved, and died alone. And he goes into, in his description, like, since he wasn't actually there to witness it, he imagines what it's like to live alone and what she goes through, and it's very beautifully written. And I'm going to read that separately. So we're going to spend some time with Frederick Douglass. We're going to look at his writing of the 4th of July, because he talks about the 4th of July. There's, the Independence Day, which he said black people shouldn't celebrate it because we weren't free on the 4th of July. We're going to look at that writing. We're going to look at the different, I'm going to read Lady of the Lake, where he got his last name Douglas, which brings me to another topic, slave names. Like, a lot of black people nowadays, they don't really hold their slave names. Just because they have a European name doesn't mean that it's their slave name. A lot of slaves, when they were freed, or a lot of blacks when they were freed from slavery, because I don't like to just label them as slaves, they chose what their last name should be. And many times we have the last names of presidents and prominent people because when the slaves got free, they wanted to be, like President Washington, or President Johnson, President Jackson, or like Benjamin Franklin. They picked the big names in American history. They didn't pick African names because they didn't know too much about Africa, and really there's not much of a connection with Africa. And I don't know, but I want to read some slave narratives about about Africans who were sold into slavery by their own, to see what their attitude is about Africans selling them as slaves. Now, I don't know if I'm going to see that, because many of these narratives that are written, they have an agenda, and their agenda is to end slavery. They're not concerned with who sold you into slavery, how this stuff. They're not historians on that. This is not, if you read these narratives, it's not like they're trying to give you a history lesson. They're trying to tell you the horrors of slavery, how it affects slaves, and how it affects white people. And Frederick Douglass goes into that. When he meets white people who never had slaves, he talks about their transformations. Actually, when he started to learn how to read, he was sold or moved into Baltimore. He met a white lady there, the mistress, and he said that she had the most beautiful face, the nicest face he'd ever seen. She was the nicest white lady he ever met. And as soon as he became her slave, she started to teach him how to read. Then her husband told her, like, you can't teach a slave how to read because it'll make them worthless slaves, and they'll start getting ideas And Frederick Douglass said that he was right, because as soon as he got that inch to learn how to read, he took that inch and went a mile. I guess in this book it says if you give a nigger an inch, he'll take an L, and an L was a certain length, and he said that he actually did do that. And that woman who taught him how to read, once she stopped, he said she started turning evil, and then she got worse than even the slave master who told her not to teach him how to read. And he goes into religion. He says that he's had slave masters that were terrible, that never had slaves before, but they became slave masters. When they got that power, they were really bad slave masters, but they didn't really have a command. But then they found religion, and he said you would think that a person who found religion or became religious would emancipate slaves. That's what he said, because if you read the Bible, slavery is wrong. He said, however, the religious slave masters were many times worse, because they used scripture to justify the beatings and the killings and the murderings of disobedient slaves. So he goes into that too, and he's very swift with the scriptures. And like I said, like he was a philologian, or philologist. That's the study of literature and the study of books and reading. And so he quotes scripture. He quotes the scriptures that the slave masters used to use to try to justify beating him. So we're going to, like I said, we're going to spend some time with Frederick Douglass. When I get done with this narrative, we're going to jump into a story that he wrote about a mutiny on a slave ship, or not a mutiny on a slave ship with a slave Madison, Washington. So if you want to look that up, you can get a PDF online, or you can download it on your Kindle for like 99 cents. But look up Mutiny of Madison, Washington. Frederick Douglass wrote about it, and Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, which is many times considered, the best American literature to have been written. That's subjective, but he wrote a book called Benito Sereno, I believe. But he wrote a book about the slave mutiny as well, and I read that book as well. So you might want to check that out. So, and Frederick Douglass was also part of women's movement. He knew Susan B. Anthony. We're going to look into that. And I've read things where she was very racist, but he had he was in the women's movement, and he was the advisor to 5 presidents, including Abraham Lincoln. So Frederick Douglass was very active in his life. We won't get too much into his personal life. I don't think so. But I'm not sure how important that is. Like the women that he married, he was married more than once, and I believe his second wife was white. But we're going to look at the work that he did and his writings and his importance. And then when we get done with Frederick Douglass, we're going to move into Harriet Jacobs, which is a narrative of the life of Linda Brent. Like she used an alias to keep herself safe, because she didn't want to get caught by the fugitive slave law, which she talks about in her narrative is a lot different than Frederick Douglass's narrative. His narrative is very brutal, very masculine, very straight to the point, and hers is a little bit, is more geared towards women. I believe that her actual writing skill, as far as literature and prose goes, is superior to Frederick Douglass's. But you'll see, I'll read excerpts of her book as well, and she talks about things that are particular to women in escaping from slavery that men didn't have to face, or that men just wouldn't write about, which is the rape and sexual molestation and things of that nature. So we're going to continue with the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. This is Black Literature, Black History. Jason Williams. Have a nice evening.